Question Friday.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Frog Questions is a weekly show where we read and discuss questions submitted by our listeners about life, the universe, or anything else that might come up. My name is Ben Mursky, and today I'm joined by Eric Coles.
Hello.
Eric, say hello. Hello. So I've actually gotten this question, which is kind of, I think, the basis that we're going to use to discuss for this whole show. I've gotten this question several times. I get it probably every other year in the Frog, which is the basic question of why Black Lives Matter, don't all lives matter? Which I think just straightforward answering that question is going to be pretty simple, but I think that the reason the question gets asked is interesting, and I think that's worth talking about, and will, I think, give us other things to discuss. So I guess first of all we should talk about what Black Lives Matter is, and you probably did more research than me, so would you like to begin by just explaining what it is?
So it's kind of twofold. I mean, I guess my initial reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement when I first heard about it, I guess 4 years ago, was that it was this group of people that were upset about how African Americans have been treated in kind of urban city, actually around the country, and it was really connected with it was connected with killings of black people, killings of black people, and they just wanted justice. Mm-hmm. That's how I initially kind of viewed it, and I viewed that, and I just kind of got that from all the news coverage, from all the pretty high profile murders and killings of black men and women in that time period. So that was my initial response and reaction.
And this was, at least what I saw, it started in 2013. It's kind of based around Trayvon Martin.
Yeah.
It was like, not that was the only one, but that was the
jumping off point.
That was the big headline that sort of led them into starting. So when I see Black Lives Matter, it's usually like a hashtag. Mm-hmm. So would you say that this is actually a question that was asked by, I think, PBS at one point, it was just a poll to the general population, is Black Lives Matter just like a social hashtag slogan, mm-hmm. or is it actually a movement? Or if it's both, which is it more of? How would you respond to that question?
I'd probably say that I think initially it started off as kind of a slogan, and then it has grown. It was probably both, but the slogan was what was catching on, and then
right.
With all these things that have happened, the movement really took off from this slogan. They used the slogan to kind of be the catalyst to really take off, and the movement, I think, is much more powerful and productive than the slogan. I think the slogan is now a secondary type of thing.
Gotcha. And as far as so that's, I guess, what it was initially was, I guess it was kind of reactionary to a bunch of things that had happened. So it's sparked by Trayvon Martin, but also just sort of prompted by what had at that point been a series of killings of black people by the police, or I guess for Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman. Yeah. Is it? Do you see that it's changed at all from 2013 through in the last 5 years? Do you think the movement? From what you know of it, do you think it's changed at all? And again, I didn't do a ton of research.
So that's an interesting question, because I think what we see on the news is that it's the same. It's the same argument. They're still fighting for the same information, or the same kind of equality.
Right.
But doing research, I was actually able to find that they are much more grassroots. They're doing a lot more than just arguing about inequality for African Americans, but they're actually like making arguments for all people of color, and they have set up, all these chapters in several cities around the country. and they do a lot more of community outreach and community organizations, projects that were actually quite interesting. I was very surprised to see that they were just more than this angry group of people who were like looking at, bust police officers for their wrongdoing.
Which I think is what we see a lot on, like, either on TV or on YouTube. We see a lot more of that, probably because it's more sensational. So I guess let's just start by answering the question. Why Black Lives Matter? Don't all lives matter?
No, I think all lives.
No, only Black lives matter.
All lives do matter. All lives do matter. But
so then why? So if all lives matter, then why make a slogan that says Black Lives Matter? Why not just have the slogan be All Lives Matter? What's the benefit of specifying this one demographic?
I think it's because African American voices have been squashed for so long that while we all, acknowledge that all lives matter, that's not the reality when it comes to people being able to say what they feel is correct and appropriate, or if they're able to say what they want. The way that it's worked is that there's a group of people that are allowed to say what they want, and there are no repercussions, while others, another group, can say something or would say something, and there's a negative repercussion to them saying it, or doing something. So that's so in reality, it's not equal. So this Black Lives Matter is just this group of people who are in this movement that's trying to make sure that, hey, we're heard just as much as the man over there.
Right. And I think your answer to that question is kind of predicated on the idea of white privilege, which I think is a concept that many people, specifically non-racist white people, well, and racist white people, I guess, don't really understand and may not even accept as being a real thing. So I think in a little bit, I think we need to talk about what white privilege is and how it's defined, and maybe whether or not it exists, because I think your answer to why would we use the slogan Black Lives Matter is based on the idea that Black people in America maybe aren't being heard or don't have the same repercussions to their actions that white people do. And that's essentially white privilege. So we need to talk about that also. So I think maybe we just put a pin in that for now, because I want to talk about white privilege in a little bit. So from what I've seen, Black Lives Matter isn't really, it doesn't really have any sort of hierarchy. So there's no person who's leading the movement that makes the call. It's kind of just, there's separate there's something like 30 chapters around the country, and they kind of all act independently of one another, which I think can lead to issues with how we interpret what Black Lives Matter is, because different chapters may be acting in different ways, and there's no one really who can speak for the group. So there's been a lot of criticism of Black Lives Matter. So I'm just going to read through some of the things some of the things people have said that have been critical of Black Lives Matter. I'd just be interested to hear your take on this. So people have criticized, tactics, first of all, that a lot of what we see on the news and on YouTube, and you've already touched on this, is just that there are riots that can end up protests that can turn into riots. Then we have violence and vandalism on the streets, and whether or not this actually is Black Lives Matter may be another thing, but we see this slogan Black Lives Matter maybe on t-shirts or on signs being held by people who are enacting violence in the streets. So that may be misinterpreted, maybe it's not misinterpreted. There's been a lot of people have said that they are anti-police, which comes from, there's a lot of the chants that you'll see at these the gatherings and protests seem to be specifically targeting police. And then have you heard of the Ferguson effect? I hadn't until yesterday.
I've heard of it. I'm not 100% sure what that is.
Apparently the Ferguson effect is this idea that when a cop shoots someone and then there's a lot of bad publicity around it, it makes other police officers afraid of acting. So they sort of scale back. Police presence gets scaled back sometimes, and you might see a rise in crime because the police aren't doing their jobs because they're afraid of getting in trouble. So this is another thing that people have. And I think I'm just going to stop there. Oh, no, I'm sorry. There's one more. So this is there's been a lot of civil rights leaders. I have Reverend Cecil Murray and then Barbara Ann Reynolds, who wrote the biography on Jesse Jackson. They've both been cited as critical of Black Lives Matter because Black Lives Matter, in their words, have not taken into account the fact that black-on-black violence is much higher than the shootings of black people by other black people is a much higher percentage of shootings than the shootings of black people by police officers. Yeah. So I just dumped like 3 or 4 things out there, but the summary is people have been critical of the movement. So as someone who, you were talking about how you had this poster for Black Lives Matter, and as someone who I guess I should just ask you first, or do you feel like you think it's a positive movement? Are you a supporter of the movement, or do you think?
Okay, the movement.
I sort of made that assumption, and I shouldn't have.
And I'm a supporter of the movement. I'm also, I like what they do, and I like. I think their ideal is good. I think they have a good message of what they're trying to get across. And like you kind of mentioned it. We don't know if everyone, or actually, we don't know if each chapter has different agendas.
Right.
And that is a dangerous thing when you've got one chapter acting one way and another chapter or several other chapters, trying to do things a little bit more conventional.
Yeah.
But I think it all kind of stems from frustration. I mean, I think a lot of the movement leaders or participants in the movement are frustrated with how things have been going or not going for their community. And so that causes a lot of angst, and it causes a lot of what we see on the news of people kind of losing their minds and being violent. And it's
I also think it's probably easier to make the news if you're being violent than if you're being peaceful. Yeah. So maybe we happen to see a lot more of that. I also think, what do you think about this? There's so much out there now, and the internet's forever. We have so many videos just posted on YouTube of, and the captions will be like, Black Lives Matter protesters being violent in some way. And a lot of the time, and I'm not even sure, I don't know. I definitely don't know. I don't know if anyone knows how often this is actually a Black Lives Matter sponsored movement and how often it's just people
coming together,
chanting Black Lives Matter or holding posters that say Black Lives Matter and then enacting violence. Did you want to talk about, you said they actually do things besides protests, which I think the protests are the things that get the big headlines, where it's like Black Lives Matter is doing a protest. Yeah. But they do more than this. Is there anything you wanted to talk about?
I mean, I just from doing a little bit of research, I saw that they're highly involved in their communities, which I think is a good thing. And I think they're out there teaching young people, but also community members about social justice in a positive way. And one of the things, like, initially we always see that it's violent, these violent protests, blah, blah, blah. But one of the things that I saw on their website was that they are teaching, actually, we want to teach nonviolent protests. We want to go out there. And so they have like a whole link and a whole page, too, of ways that we can have nonviolent protests to spread our word, our message, but not have to be violent about it. But that's still, it's amazing what we see, very little examples of those on YouTube news, and we always see the other end. And so that makes me believe that there are a lot of angry people out there that like to just jump in and get on the bandwagon, so to speak, and stir things up. And and Black Lives Matters is that movement is kind of the scapegoat for, some people who don't necessarily want to do the things the correct way.
Yeah, and actually, so this is the end of the research that I've done.
Okay.
I have 5 statistics,
right.
and this is the only research that I've done. But these are statistics of the people who, as you say, are jumping on the bandwagon. Mm-hmm. So 41% of white people think this is divided into whites and blacks mm-hmm. because segregation. Yeah. I guess it is interesting. I feel like whenever when I take a survey and they ask for your race, I always feel like, well, why do you need to know that? Yeah. But then it is interesting seeing it broken down into how white people versus black people respond to questions like this. Yeah. Okay, this is, I guess, worth knowing. 41% of white people think that Black Lives Matter supports violence. Mm-hmm. This is not a stance, and it's not. I don't really have opinions about this, but this is just sort of a snapshot of the opinions of people. This is in 2015, so it's 3 years old. Again, this is the same poll that PBS did. 82% of black people think that Black Lives Matter is a nonviolent movement. So that's, in the black community, very high percentage think, oh, this is a nonviolent, just sort of civil rights, your standard movement, where white people are thinking, oh, this is almost half of the white population think that they support violence. Yeah. 59% of blacks think that Black Lives Matter will be effective in the long term, bringing about change. 59% of white people think that Black Lives Matter distracts from the real issues of racism in the country. And this is another just like out of balance one. 35% of white people and 83% of black people have a favorable view of the movement. So this doesn't really mean anything about Black Lives Matter specifically. It doesn't say anything about the movement, but what it is just people's perception. Yeah. And you can see that people's perception is very different, mm-hmm. which means that regardless of what Black Lives Matter actually is or does, there's a huge difference in how people perceive it. Specifically for the black population, this is a good thing that's going to bring about change in a nonviolent way. Mm-hmm. And for the white population, it's like something to be afraid of that is not helpful. Yeah. So I'm borderline stumped on this, but do you have any suggestions or ideas? Like, how can we move towards reconciling these ideas? Or is there anything you think Black Lives Matter could do as a movement to try to either educate or get everybody in the same boat?
Well, you already said it earlier, in that America likes to sensationalize all mm-hmm. these types of things.
We do.
And that is the biggest hurdle, so to speak, because if you look on their website, you look at kind of the events and
mm-hmm.
the things that they're doing in those communities, they're all like legit, easy, like nonviolent activities.
Yeah.
They're trying to promote their movement, but also trying to draw people in their community together. And I'm sure that all those communities that they're in are not strictly black.
Sure.
They're multiracial, and they're getting people. And if you even look on the news at those protests, it's not just black people there. It's
right. Yeah. No, that's true.
So it'd be interesting if, when someone's filming the Black Lives Matter movement, it's not in reaction to someone being killed, but mm-hmm. it's being proactive to say, hey, they are doing really good things. They are out there doing this in the community. But we never see that.
Right. Yeah.
No one ever sees it.
I don't think I've ever, and this isn't a judgment call by me, it's just an observation. I don't know that I have ever, or at least I have very rarely seen like positive, proactive footage of Black Lives Matter.
I've seen it once.
And so, and the fact that I haven't seen it may also just be a result of, maybe we would even phrase it as like the circles that I run in. Mm-hmm. So if you look at just my social media circles, it's going to be predominantly white people who maybe have the same sort of opinions that you're going to see in PBS. So the things that are maybe being shared towards me are going to be stilted in one direction, which is, I guess we haven't answered the question of what Black Lives Matter can do. And maybe it's not on Black Lives Matter, because honestly, at a certain point, how much what else can you do? Because you're not going to have camera crews coming out to film church picnics. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not something that's interesting. It's interesting when there's a violent riot.
What else can they do? I mean, I think they can continue to try to have the dialogue with the government or like the elected officials to try to maybe equalize or level the playing field, so to speak. They can still go out and have peaceful marches and still be vigilant and active in their own communities, with the hope of one day the media sources like pick those up and say, hey, this is what Black Lives Matter is doing now. But I guess for them to actually get any true tread and movement is that we have to have some type of reaction to some negative thing, and it's unfortunate. But
so I think a lot of we're talking about Black Lives Matter, and that was the question, and that's kind of the whole point of this. But I want to just stop talking about that movement specifically for a second, because I think a lot of these problems are based on ideas, and we already hit on white privilege, that if these ideas, whether or not these ideas exist, impact maybe how we should look at Black Lives Matter. And the two big ones that I think we need to talk about are, these are words that are just in the water. Everyone's heard them, but I think people may have different perceptions about them, the same way they have different perceptions about Black Lives Matter. So white privilege and then systemic or institutional racism are both things that I think we should define and talk about whether or not they exist. And how maybe, I think that will lead us back to maybe Black Lives Matter and get a little bit of closure on this. But do you want to define white privilege?
Do you want a technical definition? Because I have that.
Well, why don't you give me the technical? You looked up the technical definition. I didn't look up any definitions for that. Like I said, my research is done. I want to start with the technical definition, but I actually think it's more important to use your definition and my definition, because I think those are going to be representative of what people actually think about it. And at a certain point, I think it stops mattering what the dictionary says, and it only really matters what people think. So let's start with the technical definition.
And this is just to jump on that too. My own personal definition is hard to actually put into words, and I always use maybe specific examples, but I'll try to define it. So the definition that I found was that the advantages bestowed on those of non-color that is often not recognized by white people. It is the things that white people can do or say or to buy that a person of color may not be able to. So that was one of the technical definitions.
What was the last line? Something a person can buy? Yeah,
like buy a home or...
okay.
That a person of color may not, have the ability to, may not be able to do. And so my own kind of example of white privilege is that being a person of color kind of takes you out of the running for, or takes you out of the ability to do the same thing as someone who is white can do. That they will have the opportunity or the luxury or afforded the ability to do something or move up in a position, or there's lots of kind of caveats that go with it, more so than a person of color, strictly because of their race and my race. It's like a clear, invisible line that separates us. And on one side, it's good, and the other side, it's not as good.
Do we call that racism, or is there a difference here between like what you're describing and just racism?
It's a gray area.
Okay.
It's a gray area there.
Just when you're an example of what you've laid out is just that a person of color may not be hired to a position. They may be passed over in favor of a white person, which, to my understanding, just is racism, right? It's interesting because I think racism, or the idea of what racism is, has changed. Where this overt racism, people advocating for like segregation and whatever, I think is actually going extinct. Is in my opinion, you can disagree with me on this. I think it's got to be getting close to almost non-existent. It is still existent because I know there are still, the KKK is still around. There's still a lot of people who are actively racist, but I just feel like it's becoming, it is not socially acceptable to be racist. No one supports these like white supremacist movements, and just in terms of natural selection, it's hard to get a girlfriend if you are a racist. But what we mean by racist, I guess, is changing. So when I say, it's hard to get a girlfriend if you think that white people are better than black people, maybe. But there may be some forms of racism that are extant in the population still. So, and this is maybe leading to what we call institutional racism. Am I correct here?
Yeah.
Can we move into that? Or
Sure.
So I guess institutional racism is a term that I think started in the 60s, late 60s. It's closer to the idea that it's not individual people that we're looking at as being racist. So it's not that senators or the president or congressmen are racist. It's the idea that there's a system that's been put in place. And that system was probably created by actual racists, which is fine. But if those actual racists are... oh, I mean, like... the fact that we call those people racist is fine. Racism is not fine. No, thank you for that catch. That could have been bad. The fact that we call them racist is fine. But those people are fewer and fewer. I know they're still around, but they won't be around for much longer. But these systems that are in place that are kind of just how we exist in the world will continue to be there until they're changed. And it's hard to see societal change because it's the way that we're used to living, which creates a really kind of murky way forward. Yeah. And I think is part of the reason that maybe Black Lives Matter is having trouble getting a foothold, and maybe they're affecting positive change within communities, and maybe even they're affecting change on the government level, but just in terms of perception, they're still perceived as a violent movement that is not having positive change, and maybe this is part of it.
Yeah. So your idea of institutional racism is that these groups, not people, but these groups have. I
think so. Do you agree with that, or would you add anything to that?
No, I would. I think that's exactly what it is. It's not individualized for a person, but it's more grouped together. That these organizations, government officials or government groups or banks or anything, they are being racist, and because of that, it's kind of like a way of life. It's a culture that's been going for so long that it doesn't change.
Right. So let's circle back to white privilege. Yeah. Does white privilege exist?
I believe so.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm a white person, and I don't feel like I'm privileged. So how would you explain to me that I have privilege? If I'm just sort of... and I think this is a very common viewpoint, is that there's a lot of white people who maybe aren't getting the jobs that they want or can't get into the school that they want to get into. And the reality for a lot of, especially younger white people, I think my general feeling is that every generation is kind of better than the generation before it. Yeah. We get better and better. So especially this younger generation is mostly, I think, kind of on the right track. And especially if we want to look at the white population, like they're not racist. Yeah. They believe in equality. It's this message is out there. The message of equality is out there, and they believe in it. So from their point of view, okay, we are all equal. All races are equal. But now they're being told that they're privileged still, and I think this is a hard thing to grasp, especially if you're a young white person. They can understand how white slave owners in the past were privileged, but it's maybe harder to grasp how am I privileged here and now when the country seems to preach, equality and equal rights for everybody.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I actually have the answer. I think it is more generational. I think you're right. Your generation and younger generation, it's more indoctrined that it's been in their head that they that there's more equality out there, and but I probably consider me coming up when I was your age, that was probably not the case. That that there was many examples of privilege where that I had to kind of fight through or get through some of those things, and I had to very much know my place.
Yeah, and I think that's worth mentioning too, is that you and I probably had very different experiences of just childhood and being raised, and that there were probably things from early on that you were taught, like just sort of like a sit-down talk from your parents, simply based on your appearance, that I didn't have. That isn't part of my life experience, and that's I think a really interesting part of this too. I also think it's interesting that race, I've heard this said before, and it's basically true. Race is kind of a made up concept. Like in terms of biology, we're all human beings. Like we're all the same race. So race actually doesn't exist. But just like in birds, you may have birds that are slightly different colors from each other, and birds don't seem to care about it. But people have this same thing, that in appearance, there's something slightly different about us. It actually isn't. It isn't a different. Now there may be slight differences in, I guess, certain quote unquote races, or maybe more likely to get certain diseases or something like that. You may see. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but that's not a result of the concept of race is made up. It's not actually something scientifically you would say, oh, this is a different race of creature than this. It's we're all human beings and we just happen to look different. So it's interesting that this is a made up concept, but it actually has real consequences for people who look differently. And these consequences really are they are actually just based on appearance more than descent. So you could be, this is just the first example that's jumping into my head, not necessarily relevant to what we're talking about, but there's this idea that you're not allowed to say the N-word unless you're actually African American. Well, but see, and that's the thing. It's actually not African American. It's black. Because black is a word that describes the way you look, not who you're descended from. So you can actually have someone who's probably not a half, but let's go a quarter African in descent, but if they look white, it's not okay for them to say this word, because and this is this, I think, is getting towards the idea of privilege. The N-word, maybe you could say, is a privilege for black people. They're the only one. But if you want to look at it, I think this is it's an interesting illustration of how privilege is affected by the way you look. So I may be African. I'm not. But I may be African. But if I look white, it's suddenly not okay for me to say this word that I've been told is, this is just a thing that African Americans are allowed to say. But it's actually not African Americans. It's just blacks. And I think that's what we're getting at with
you could be a white African.
Oh, it's true. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Yeah. So.
But it's because that word is rooted in the history of people being subjugated for how they look, not because of where they're from. So that's where privilege, I think, comes from. So my illustration of white privilege that I try to do for my class starts with this. I have this very cartoony villain who's not a racist, but he's just I think a lot of privilege or a lot of institutional racism comes from housing. That's I think, at least in my opinion, the root of almost all well, no, not almost all, a good portion of institutional racism. starts with housing.
And Baltimore is ripe with it.
Ripe with it.
No, I mean, that's one of the units that I do with Raising the Sun. It talks about it.
So I start with this like cartoon villain who's he's kind of evil, but he's not racist. So he doesn't actually care about the color of people's skin. He just wants to make money. So he's greedy. So he buys up all this land and charges like really exorbitant rent on his tenants. And it's not motivated by race. It's just motivated by he's just like a bad guy. He's greedy. So then you bring in an actual racist who comes up with this idea of zoning or like redlining, and we say, to screw over the black population, we'll make them live in this greedy guy's area, and now and the white people get to live in this other area that maybe doesn't charge as high rent. So now we say all the racists die. So the people who made all of the blacks move into this area, they're dead. So racism's dead. But the problem is the black people are still they're still living in this area that's charging high rent. And it's no longer motivated by racism, because the guy who's charging the high rent just wants to get rich. So he's going to say, I'm not racist. If they don't want to live here, they can leave. But the problem is, so maybe we say redlining is gone. Ideally, in an ideal world, we say that black people are allowed to live wherever they want. We're just going to pretend that that's true. Even if that's true, you now have people who are living in an area where the rent is so high they are not able to save up enough money to move out. This is a very simplistic version of the housing problem and institutional racism, but now we can't save up enough money to move out. We can't afford to send our kids to better colleges. Crime rate is just going to be higher in places that are poorer, because that's the way that people work. And what you end up with is it's sort of a cycle, right? Because you can't move out. And I think that's the best way probably to illustrate what institutional racism is, especially not, and I know this is very idealistic of me, and I get in trouble a lot of times when I say I feel like racism is going extinct. People are just like, no, it's not. It's still here, institutional racism. But what I mean by that is like individual people who are actively racist or actively trying to keep down people of color are scant. And I think very soon there just won't be any, because it's not acceptable. Like, people don't like white supremacists. It makes everyone uncomfortable.
Well,
probably
maybe down south.
And they're still here. I know the KKK is still here. I know they're still active, but it can't last much longer. And my thinking is like maybe two generations. We're maybe 2 generations away from just there being no more racist people. But getting rid of all the racists doesn't actually get rid of the problems that were caused by the racists, which is why I think we come back to this young white population that feels like everyone's equal, everyone has equal rights. How can you say that I'm privileged? I'm not a racist. But this is the issue, is that maybe you're not racist, but you may, in some ways that you don't know, still be reaping the benefits of racist policies.
Tendencies and policies.
Well,
that's a great point.
So that's my diatribe on my cartoon greedy villain and the housing. Did you have anything you want to say about housing?
No, I mean the housing stuff is, doing research on that last year was interesting. And granted, I'm very aware that Baltimore is a very segregated city years ago, and still is to some degree. So to know that that there was housing tenants that put into place that no blacks could live in Rogers Forge, which is down the street, and what I consider a pretty multicultural, a pretty diverse area, but that when that was written, people who were living in the city, white folks that were living in the city decided, I got to move out because all the people of color are moving into the city. And so it's interesting now because the city taxes are so high. County taxes are lower, but that there was actually something written, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised by that, but that there was something written that says that, if you're black, you can't live here. I don't know. It blew me for It just took me for a spin.
Yeah, it's crazy that right. You don't,
but I knew that it was there. I just wasn't expecting to still see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's again, if we go back to like the young white population, I'm sure that is not something you would think. You just like, oh, there's no way that's true. No, you hear that and you just say that can't be. That can't be true.
It was interesting. So reading the article and watching a video of it, they interviewed a lot of younger white people who were mortified by the fact that that tenet was still in place last year.
Right.
And so the fact that, they're like, I can't believe this, and this has to change. So you're right. This younger generation is moving in that direction. They are very socially conscious and don't like racism.
Right.
Don't like white supremacists. And so, that is a good step in the generation. But I think you might be right. It's going to take a while, another 3, maybe 4 generations of people to.
And I don't even know. If then the question is, well, is there anything we can do to speed it along, or is there anything? And if we can circle back to Black Lives Matter, and the original question for them is, what can you do if you're Black Lives Matter? What can you do to improve your polling numbers?
People don't like change, so
people don't like change. I heard it was an interesting comment I heard somewhere that, well, let's take like Facebook became this dominant, I guess, social structure, but it's this online. I mean, it's a media outlet. So this online media outlet that people use, and it's the one that everyone uses. And then, did you ever use Google Plus?
No, I just never.
So right. So Google comes up with this. They studied social media accounts, and they came up with one that was better, and they called it Google Plus. And I've looked at Google Plus, and my first reaction was just, this is better. It's like what Facebook was trying to do, but they did it better. Yeah. And no one uses Google Plus. And the reason why, pretty much, is that you can have a system in place that people are used to, that where everyone lives, and then you can come up with a better one and say, we should all do it this way. And everyone can look at it and say, yeah, we should do it that way. But you still won't see a movement in that direction because people are used to living a certain way. Yeah. And all my friends are on Facebook. If I move to Google Plus, my friends won't be there.
By yourself, yeah.
So I'm not going to move, and so no one moves to Google Plus. Yeah. It's the same way that Craigslist is a service that isn't actually that great. Yeah. It could be done much better, and I'm sure people have tried to come up with a better way of doing Craigslist. No one uses it because people are already selling stuff on Craigslist. I already have stuff for sale on Craigslist. Why would I leave Craigslist? Yeah. Anyway, so I guess there's no hope. Is there no answer?
There's always hope.
There's always hope, but there is no answer.
There's no answer. There's always hope. Answer. It's going to take a while.
Can I tell you what I would like to see from Black Lives Matter? Sure. And maybe this is just me being a Catholic, but it makes me uncomfortable that it's decentralized. The fact that all the chapters operate independently. I think it would be nice if there was like a unified approach to how it can move forward. And maybe that's not the right direction to go, but with organizations like this, I just feel like especially when there's stuff happening all over and there's getting bad media feedback, I think it'd be nice to have a person in charge or a group of people in charge who can speak on behalf of Black Lives Matter. Because right now I don't feel like there's anybody who can stand up and say, we support nonviolence, we condemn the actions of this group that was rioting. And because we're not hearing that, it just seems like anyone wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt is acting on behalf of Black Lives Matter.
You're 100% correct.
Okay.
I 100% agree with you on that one. And even despite the fact that, they do have leadership in terms of the founders, it'd be interesting. I guess I don't know if they take an active role anymore.
I'm not sure. Is this what? Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi. Yeah. They were the 3 founders of it. I know they're still involved, but as far as I can see, they are not like the president, vice president.
You don't see them.
Yeah,
they're involved, but you don't. You don't really see them.
Which is not, I'm not going to put it on them. Like, they had a good idea.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they have to be the king, the in charge of the whole thing.
But it might.
But it would help. Yeah.
I mean, I know they had, what's the guy from Baltimore, DeRay, forgot his last name, who worked for he was like really involved in the first kind of movement of Black Lives Matter, and then has been very vigilant and prevalent in the community. But he's not actually like in the hierarchy of if you check out kind of their hierarchy, he's not really up there. But he's the face of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that and he's a Baltimore guy. So
it's just like unofficial.
He's unofficial, but he's like an unofficial official like leader.
Yeah.
And I think he gained a lot of notoriety with his presence down and after Trayvon Martin was killed. And who was the next one? Was it
Freddie Gray?
No, it wasn't Freddie.
Oh,
it was Eric Gardner or
yeah, Eric Garner. Was that 2014?
Mike Brown.
Okay.
Mike Brown was the second one. And then Eric Gardner. My wife and I did a chronological order a couple weeks ago on when all this like start. Like what really sparked the Black Lives Matter movement? And it was like Trayvon.
There were like 14 high-profile ones that happened between.
But then there was a ton of other ones that we didn't even hear about.
Yeah, well, it's hard to say, like, when did police start unfairly shooting black people?
True, but that was the most high-profile.
The more accurate question is just, like, when did we start reporting?
Yes.
Like, these...
When did video cameras start to come?
When did phones invent video cameras is your actual question. Jeez. And this is, I mean, it's also, I just want to say, I feel like I've been fairly positive towards Black Lives Matter. And Black Lives Matter does have a perception of being very anti-police, and I don't want to give that impression at all. And I also want to acknowledge that the police are doing a really important service, and I think sometimes there can be a perception, especially if you're in a community that is very, I guess, pro Black Lives Matter, or maybe you start to see the police as antagonists to this movement. I just want to say that's not that. I think that's definitely a step in the wrong direction, and I've talked to people who have this idea that police are just looking for an excuse to shoot black people, and I would be open to an argument that is true for a couple police officers, but for the most part, that is not the case. And I think, well, I don't have statistics on this, so I'm not going to pretend that I know it, but it's that police are not roaming the streets looking to shoot black people, as I hear students say that. And I can understand where that perception comes from when you have multiple high-profile shootings all in the space of a couple of years. It's just like, oh my goodness, this is like a,
police got a bad rap, and there's several bad apples in this bunch of police officers that really has made it difficult to be a police officer.
Right, which goes back to the Ferguson effect. You now have all these like good cops who are just afraid of either afraid of violence being enacted on them, which I think there was at Ferguson where there were cops who were just shot just for being cops. Like it was just like a shooting.
Was that?
I thought it was in Ferguson. Oh, there definitely was one in Dallas.
It was right after.
It had. I'm sure it's happened more than once, but Dallas definitely was. There was a big one there. I mean, it's definitely not an easy time to be a cop either. And I think you have these black communities and the police officer communities where you have the Blue Lives Matter slogan coming out too, sometimes feel like they're being pitted against each other, which is unfortunate because that's not really the issue. I think
it goes back to the initial question. All lives matter.
all lives do matter. So if just once and for all, if you're talking to somebody who would ask the question, why Black Lives Matter, don't all lives matter? Is there anything just in conclusion that you would want to say to that person?
All lives matter. I mean, clearly, obviously, all lives do matter. And maybe Black Lives Matter slogan or movement is just an attempt to be heard, just an attempt for the field to be level and that to be heard about, or have to maybe the ability to have some more open conversations. That's it. That's what I got.
Awesome. Okay, so I don't have any follow-up questions for this. Sometimes I have a lot of questions at the end, so we're just going to skip right to the end. So if you want to submit a question for a future podcast episode or ask questions while podcast episodes are being recorded, you can follow Frog Questions on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Snapchat. If you have a comment on today's show or anything else, you can submit that at frogquestions.com. Eric Coles, thank you for being here.
And Mercy, thank you so much.
Any final comments? Anything you want to say?
No, this has been enlightening, and it's been a good conversation. I think it's an important conversation.
Yeah, I think it's important too.
Yeah.
I also think it's uncomfortable to, especially for, I think, the younger, and I'll just speak for white people, for younger white people who feel like, and the way that I feel, it's like, oh, I'm not racist at all. It's hard to have this conversation because it involves acknowledging that we are different races, and the fact that this conversation happened, even if it wasn't spoken out loud, started with me saying I'm white and you're black and we're different somehow, and that's a very uncomfortable thing, I think, for people to do. And I think the younger generation is just, with this equality message being pushed on them, the presumption is we're exactly the same, period. You know, let's not talk, like, talking about Black Lives Matter is almost racist, you know, like this idea that if we're talking about it, we're prolonging the problem. And I just think it's important to acknowledge the problem's there, and the problem's going to continue to be there until we keep talking about it. And it's unfortunate that we're in this position and we didn't create the problem. But I think I think these conversations are really important. So thank you for taking the time to do this today.
I always live by that motto of leaning into the discomfort, and this is one of those good conversations to lean into.
good uncomfortable conversation to lean into. Okay. Well, that concludes our show for this week. We will see you next week.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to Frog Questions wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss an episode. For more information or to ask a question of your own, please visit frogquestions.com.